Most people assume that good conversation comes down to knowing what to say, finding the right story, making an interesting observation, saying something clever at the right moment. But if you spend time around people who are truly good at conversation, you begin to notice several things. They don't necessarily talk more than everyone else. They aren't always the most entertaining people in the room, and yet conversations around them tend to feel easy. I'm someone who engages in a lot of conversations across a wide range of scenarios, and I've noticed that graceful conversations usually have much less to do with clever words, charisma, or witty repartee, which is what many of us imagine. Instead, it has much more to do with understanding how conversations unfold and how to manage them. Welcome back to Gracefully Lori. I'm Lori. If you're new here, this channel is for women who want to live authentically, express themselves with intention, and move through the world with quiet, modern grace. When you look closely at conversations that feel natural, they rarely unfold randomly. Instead, they tend to follow a certain kind of structure, much like the architecture of a building. So I think of this as the architecture of a conversation. When the structure is sound, everything inside the space works easily. When it isn't, even polite conversations can feel strained. Today, I want to walk through 5 elements that often shape graceful conversations. And the first one begins before the conversation even starts. Element 1. Why do some conversations feel easy from the very beginning, while others feel slightly forced, even when everyone is being polite? Most conversations begin in roughly the same way. 2 people meet, someone asks a question, someone responds. On the surface, nothing seems especially different from one interaction to another. And yet the tone of the conversation can feel different. The conversation can open up almost immediately. People seem relaxed. Ideas begin to build naturally from one thought to the next. The exchange starts to feel comfortable. Other conversations feel slightly more strained. Each person seems to be searching for what to say next. Often no one can quite explain why the interaction feels that way. A graceful woman guiding a conversation isn't focused on performing well. She's focused on the other person, because graceful conversation usually begins with curiosity about the person in front of you. Much like constructing a building, everything that follows depends on a solid foundation. And in conversation, that foundation is genuine interest in learning more about the other person. Once that curiosity is present, the conversation begins to open naturally. If someone mentions a place they recently visited, a curious conversationalist might ask what stood out to them about being there. If someone mentions a project they're working on, they may ask what part of it has been most engaging. Rather than moving quickly to a new topic, they stay with one thread of the conversation for a moment longer. This is called naturally pulling a thread. Some people also use the latter approach, where they deliberately make sure to focus on a specific topic for at least 3 questions. But here's the important thing. Sometimes a simple detail is enough to open richer conversation. Someone briefly mentions a hobby, a book they've read, or a place they hope to visit. A curious conversationalist notices those details and explores them for a moment. Those small follow-up questions, best if they're open-ended, questions without a yes or no answer, allows people to feel heard. And that curiosity quietly becomes the foundation on which the rest of the conversation is built. And once that foundation is in place, the next element shapes how easily the exchange unfolds. Element 2. Why do some conversations seem to begin effortlessly while others feel slightly awkward in the first few moments? Most conversations include a brief opening moment where both people are quietly deciding how the interaction will unfold. Someone asks a question. How has your week been? What have you been working on lately? How do you know the host? In those first few seconds, people are often deciding how much of themselves they want to bring into the exchange. Sometimes the conversation finds its rhythm almost immediately. Other times, there's a small hesitation. Both people are perfectly polite, but the interaction feels slightly tentative, as if someone is waiting for the conversation to settle. If you watch people who seem comfortable in conversation, you begin noticing something about how they handle this moment. They make the entrance into the conversation feel easy. Much like entering a well-designed building, the entrance shapes the experience that follows. In conversation, the entrance is the way we step into to the exchange. When the opening feels natural, people relax and the conversation begins to move forward more easily. Often that entrance simply acknowledges the moment the two people already share. At a gathering, someone might ask how the other person knows the host. At an event, they might comment briefly on the talk or the setting. In professional settings, they might ask what kind of work someone's been enjoying lately. These opening questions are easy for the other person to answer and give the conversation a natural starting point. Once that entrance feels comfortable, another element determines the success of the conversation. Element 3. One of the reasons people feel anxious about conversation is that they believe they're responsible for sustaining a long exchange. They imagine standing with someone for 20 or 30 minutes, trying to keep the conversation going the entire time. And that pressure alone can make even naturally social people feel tense. They think, what if the conversation stalls? What if they run out of things to say? What if the exchange becomes awkward? But if you observe how most social interactions actually happen, you'll notice that very few conversations last that long. At gatherings, dinners, and events, conversations tend to move naturally from person to person and from moment to moment. You speak with someone for a few minutes, someone else joins the exchange, or the conversation gently dissolves as people move through the space. Conversations are less like one long hallway and much more like a series of rooms. You step into a conversation, spend a few minutes there, and when the moment naturally shifts, you move into another. Much like moving through a well-designed home, you don't stay in every room for the entire evening. This is the flow between conversations. You simply visit for a while before continuing on. And once people begin to see conversations this way, a great deal of pressure tends to disappear. You're no longer responsible for sustaining one long, continuous discussion. You're simply participating in the moment you're currently in. At larger gatherings, the rhythm can be even more fluid. You greet someone, share a short exchange, and then naturally continue circulating through the room. Each of these conversations becomes its own small moment within the larger evening. And once you recognize this rhythm, conversation often begins to feel much easier. You're not trying to carry the entire evening on your shoulders. You're simply stepping into one room at a time. And as those small moments unfold, something else often begins to happen. The next element of graceful conversation. Element 4. Have you ever noticed that some conversations seem to remain between just two people, while other conversations expand gradually? Someone joins the exchange, another person has a thought. Before long, the conversation includes several voices and feels lively and engaging. This doesn't usually happen because someone dominates the discussion or tries to control it. In fact, conversations tend to expand most naturally when no one is trying too hard to manage them. Instead, there are small moments that allow another person to step into the exchange. Sometimes someone nearby mentions something related to what's being discussed. Sometimes another person has been listening quietly and simply needs a natural opening to contribute. Graceful women know how to create openings almost without thinking about it. Much like arches in architecture connect different spaces within a building, graceful conversationalists create small openings that allow others to enter the discussion. They widen the conversation just enough for someone else to step in. Often this happens through simple acknowledgments or invitations. Some might say, "That's interesting. I'd love to hear what you think about that." Or, "You mentioned earlier that you've worked in that field." Sometimes it's even as simple as briefly turning to someone who has been listening and saying, "What has your experience been like?" Those small moments don't interrupt the conversation. Instead, they allow the discussion to expand naturally. People feel included, and the exchange becomes richer because more perspectives enter the room. Once conversations begin flowing this way, they often feel easy and engaging for everyone involved. That brings us to our final element, element 5. If beginning a conversation can feel uncertain, leaving one can sometimes feel even more uncomfortable. Many people hesitate when a conversation seems to be winding down. They worry about appearing abrupt. They worry about interrupting the exchange, or they worry that stepping away might make the other person feel dismissed. So they remain in the conversation longer than they intended. The discussion continues even though people may sense that the moment has already begun to pass. Since conversations rarely last for the entire evening, people naturally move through the space. They greet different people. They step into one conversation, then another. Someone pauses to greet a friend they just noticed across the room. Another person excuses themselves to refresh a drink or check on the host. These small transitions happen constantly and no one finds them unusual. So a simple truth emerges. Just as you leave one room in a home to explore another, conversations naturally come to a close so that people can continue moving through the social space. Graceful conversationalists understand this rhythm. They don't treat the end of the conversation as something awkward that must be avoided. Instead, they acknowledge the exchange and transition naturally. Often, this can be as simple as saying, "I've really enjoyed this conversation. It was so nice hearing about that. I'm going to say hello to someone I just saw, but I hope we can talk again later." These small acknowledgments allow the conversation to end comfortably while preserving the warmth of the exchange. And once you begin seeing conversations this way, your perspective changes. You no longer feel responsible for sustaining a single interaction indefinitely. You simply step into a conversation for a while and then gracefully step into the next room. Which brings us back to the larger idea behind graceful conversations. When a building is well designed, you rarely notice the architecture. You simply feel that the space works. The rooms connect easily. Movement through the space feels natural, and people instinctively understand how to move through it. Conversation is much the same. When the structure of a conversation is sound, the interaction rarely feels forced. People feel comfortable. Ideas develop naturally, and the exchange unfolds without anyone needing to manage it too carefully. Much of graceful conversation rests on a few elements that often go unnoticed. A foundation of genuine curiosity about the person in front of you, an easy entrance that allows the exchange to begin naturally, conversations that unfold room by room rather than feeling like one long performance, small openings that invite others into the discussion, and finally, a graceful exit when the moment naturally comes to a close. None of these moments are dramatic. In fact, they're often so subtle that people rarely notice them happening, but together they create conversations that feel grounded, comfortable, and easy to be a part of. It's really just about allowing that rhythm to unfold naturally. If you found this video helpful, I'd be curious to know which part of conversation you tend to notice the most. Is it beginning conversations, moving comfortably between them, or knowing when a conversation has naturally reached its end? Please share that in the comments below. I love hearing your thoughts. And if you enjoy these conversations about graceful living, the small details that quietly shape how we experience everyday life, please consider subscribing. Until next time, my graceful friends.